New York City is one of the few cities in the country that is actually addressing its top source of pollution at the pace and speed of the Paris Climate Agreement. Right now, the real estate industry is trying to gut the law by getting Mayor Adams to undo it through rules and regulations that would let them off the hook.
Welcome to Climate Check, Stories and Solutions for Fighting Climate Change. We are part of 350 Brooklyn, an organization that strives to counter the climate crisis through local action. We work towards a world that is just, equitable, and sustainable, and where all beings can thrive. I'm Eva Dean, she, her, your host of Climate Check. I'm a climate activist and a Brooklyn-based choreographer. On today's episode, we're discussing New York City's Local Law 97 that requires the city's largest buildings to become more energy efficient with the goal of reducing emissions by 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. Our guest is Pete Sikora, who is the Climate and Inequality Campaigns Director for New York Communities for Change. Hi, Pete.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Would you mind introducing yourself with your pronouns?
Sure. My name's Pete Sikora, and I'm the Climate Campaigns Director for New York Communities for Change. He, him. I live here in Brooklyn. I'm from Washington Heights.
First, I'd like to ask you, what is your climate story? How did you get involved in climate change?
I was, as a young person, always kind of a politically knowledgeable person in the sense that I read the newspaper a lot. I was that nerdy kid that was sitting in the library reading the New York Times, maybe not the most popular kid, but, there it is. And so I thought I kind of knew a lot about this stuff and was generally civically interested. But when I was in college, I needed a job for the summer, and I got one going door to door raising money for an environmental organization. And that really opened my eyes to what you could actually do in terms of affecting politics. So I became knowledgeable about issues in general. And about a decade ago, I read a lot about the issue, and in particular, Bill McKibben's writings about climate change, and just got completely flipped out and just decided that we needed to do real strategic work to take on this crisis. So I sort of made a career change from working as the political director for a large labor union in New York, doing a lot of mobilization and contract work, to making an affirmative leap to figure out how to tackle climate change and inequality at the same time.
So NYCC is New York Communities for Change. Can you tell us a bit about that mission?
New York Communities for Change is a community organizing group. We organize in Black and Latino communities in New York City and on Long Island for economic, racial, social, and climate justice.
My understanding is there's a real focus on affordable housing.
Yeah, we're a multi-issue organization that works to advance the interests of our members who are concentrated in low-income and low-middle-income communities of color. So we work on housing, on jobs, on immigration, and increasingly now on fighting climate change and trying to produce good jobs and other benefits for our membership.
New York Communities for Change is best known for your work on increasing the minimum wage.
Yeah, one of our greatest campaigns was the Fight for 15, where the organization worked in the community and with other groups and unions to fight for a $15 an hour minimum wage.
How did NYCC get involved in helping to push Local Law 97 forward?
We were looking at strategic opportunities to both fight inequality and fight climate change. We view those two things as inseparable. It's a joint twinned crisis, flip sides of the same coin, if you will. In New York City, the top source of pollution is buildings' energy use. That's about 70% of the climate heating pollution coming from the city. So that's the top challenge to solve for climate pollution. And it's also the top opportunity to create large numbers of good jobs, which our membership really needs.
It's interesting to me to learn that buildings in New York City are the biggest cause of emissions, whereas in the rest of the country, it's automobiles, right?
For the United States as a whole, cars and trucks are the top source of climate heating pollution. In New York State, the top source is building energy use, and in large part that's driven by New York City. Cars and trucks are the second largest source of pollution from New York State as a whole, and power generation, that is the electric grid, is the third. So it's buildings number one, cars and trucks number two, electric grid number three for New York State as a whole.
I'm curious about the difference there. Is it because New Yorkers' buildings are more dirty, or is it because we don't drive as much?
It's that we don't drive as much. New York City residents are about a third as polluting as your average American. And that's because we don't drive, so we don't waste tons of energy in gasoline. And we also live in apartments that are relatively small, not giant leaky buildings that use and waste a lot of energy. So those are the two big drivers of why a New York City resident can take some pride in the fact that we are less polluting on average. But our rich people are super duper polluting through flying around the world and driving a political system towards climate ruin.
Local Law 97, I was going to say that one of our strengths of 350 Brooklyn, it's one of the things I'm most proud of, is that we work in coalition with other organizations such as NYCC. Who are some of the other organizations that helped to pass LL 97?
The Working Families Party and Align and New York Communities for Change were the heart of a multi-year effort to get Local Law 97 passed. And then there were a lot of groups like 350 Brooklyn who did a truckload of work also to help propel a grassroots effort that led to enactment of the law. And then there were, of course, lots of experts and policymakers who were very concerned with this area as well.
It's another example how a groundswell of people can work towards a very vital change for climate change. I'm guessing, in fact, I know that it's the real estate companies that are probably not as happy with LL 97.
You know, that's the key opposition, the top polluter for New York City, the real estate lobby. They are the dominant source of pollution. And I think of it a little bit like factory owners in like 1950 or something. They would just kind of dump the toxic waste in the nearest river and not think about it too much. The real estate industry has been getting away with decades of polluting our air and heating the climate with essentially no limits at all. In fact, no limits, period. So Local Law 97 changes that paradigm for them, and they don't like it one little bit.
Yeah, not currently. I'm not in this situation, but when I first moved here and my next 3 apartments after that, they were way overheated.
Yeah, that's
What
super
did I
common.
do? I
Right. You
opened
open the
my
window.
window.
Right. That is an extremely common New York City story, right? That, you know, it's absurd.
Yeah.
The apartment is so hot in the winter that you have to open up the window to cool it down. That kind of energy waste is a perfect example of why this law is so important, because it forces landlords to close those kinds of ridiculous inefficiencies and upgrade the building so that it actually stops wasting energy. And that tends to save building owners money too, and it saves on utility bills. But it forces them to do a lot of work that creates a lot of jobs cutting pollution, which is great for New York City, but kind of a pain in the butt if you're a building owner.
Let's talk about what Local Law 97 actually is. We got into the thick of it. So Local Law 97 was passed in 2019 under Bill de Blasio. LL 97 requires the city's largest buildings to become more energy efficient, what we were talking about, not letting the heat just pour out of the buildings, and other energy efficiency moves, with the goal of reducing emissions by 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050.
Yeah, it's a very big deal because New York City is one of the few cities in the country that is actually addressing its top source of pollution at the pace and speed of the Paris Climate Agreement. Right now, the real estate industry is trying to gut the law by getting Mayor Adams to undo it through rules and regulations that would let them off the hook. And we cannot allow the Adams administration to gut this law, which is the world's most important city-level climate and jobs law. Unfortunately, flouting laws, housing laws, is very common in the real estate industry.
There needs to be accountability.
Exactly. There needs to be accountability. It cannot just be a law that's there on paper, but if you hire some fancy consultants, you can do some paperwork and get out of it. So the law has a penalty structure built into it that is appropriate, but it also grants the administration the discretion to use in outlier situations. What we want to make sure happens is that the administration properly implements and enforces the law and does not use its discretion to allow landlords to evade it in practice.
So a little bit of Civics 101.
Yeah.
We, 350 Brooklyn and NYCC, to try to get LL 97 passed. We got it passed. Woo!
Yeah, huge.
And then it passed in 2019. So is it being implemented currently? The rules that just came out for
Yeah.
Department of Buildings, is that to shore up accountability?
Well, let me try and explain it in really simply, which is that the first requirements take hold in 2024, so a little over a year from now. That sets specific per square foot pollution limits on buildings. It's done by type of building, use of building, but you have a specific limit on your pollution from the building. That limit applies for 5 years from 2024 to 2029. And then in 2030, a new, much tighter limit takes hold, capping your pollution from the building. So that lasts from 2030 to 2035. And then from there on in, that pollution limit keeps ratcheting down. So the speed of that limit is timed basically to the Paris Climate Agreement in aggregate. That is 40% reductions in pollution from buildings by 2030, and then over 80% by 2050. So the limit at first is actually pretty easy to achieve. That first 5-year period is almost like a warm-up period because only 20% of buildings currently exceed that limit. These are very wasteful buildings. So they're over that initial very high, easy to clear limit from 2024 to 2029. So that's the first hurdle for buildings to get over, and it shouldn't be too hard for most buildings.
What size building, and does this include condominiums, co-ops, or is this just commercial buildings?
The law covers buildings over 25,000 square feet, which visually is like half a football field of size. So you're talking effectively like a 6-story tall building all the way up to like One World Trade Center. There's a different way of treating rent-regulated buildings, which we can get into, but fundamentally about 50,000 buildings are covered, and these are the larger buildings. Now, even though it's just 5% of the city's 1 million buildings that are covered under Local Law 97, the biggest buildings, that's the majority of the pollution coming from buildings. It's the majority of the square footage, and it's a majority of the sort of real estate in the city is covered by Local Law 97. So in the future, the city is going to have to move towards equitable requirements on medium-sized and smaller buildings. But Local Law 97 fundamentally covers the largest buildings.
So I've heard from a number of sources, and we read it in the paper all the time, that transitioning to renewables, we're going to save money. Why wouldn't the real estate entities want to save money? Why wouldn't they want to retrofit their buildings?
It's a great question, and it is the question of energy efficiency. And the record is very, very clear here. Voluntary incentive programs, educational programs targeted at building owners to get them to upgrade their properties in a way that saves them money don't actually move the needle enough. You actually need requirements. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of inertia baked into the system and a lot of profit-taking baked into the system. So to take the profit-taking first, large real estate entities want very high returns on their money. A 10 or 15-year payback on an energy efficiency project, sure, that pays off eventually, but it's not the kind of high profits that they're looking for.
What about the argument for the people who are renting in a big apartment building that's under LL 97? Are their rents just going to go up?
So this law will tend to save those building owners money, but that doesn't mean that they're going to pass along the savings to those tenants. Instead, they're going to pocket those savings because they're just pegging the rent at whatever the market will bear. And similarly, when they have cost increases, they don't necessarily raise the rent because they're already at the maximum rent level and profit-taking level that they can be at. So Local Law 97, we do not expect will either raise or lower rents in any gigantic way.
So there's a REC. What REC, is that an acronym, REC?
The law also allows building owners to buy something called a renewable energy credit that interconnects into Zone J, which is the New York City electrical grid. So a renewable energy credit, or a REC, is essentially a certificate for a kilowatt of energy that is derived from a renewable energy project. So this has to be a project that's in New York State or in Canada using hydropower. And the law directs the Department of Buildings to set rules governing how to interpret what RECs are appropriate to allow for the law.
Well, this brings us back to our current mayor. Knowing that Mayor Adams' biggest contributors are real estate corporations, what can we do so that it doesn't get gutted by Mayor Adams?
Well, so the Department of Buildings is setting a whole lot of complicated rules and doing much of that very professionally and well. But there are two big areas that we are extremely concerned that Mayor Adams may use to gut or severely weaken the law. Number one is renewable energy credits, where if they do not tightly restrict renewable energy credits, as is the spirit and the purpose of the law, then they open up a gigantic loophole where landlords can just buy RECs and call it a day. That would be it. They don't need to upgrade their building, and they won't. In fact, they'll just buy cheap RECs instead of doing the upgrades that actually reduce pollution and create jobs, and that would gut the law. So that's number one path that cannot be taken.
So what do
by
we
the mayor.
do?
Before I get to that,
Sorry.
the second extremely important thing here is the enforcement of the law. So there are lots and lots of housing laws on the books that just don't go enforced in the real world. The Department of Buildings is in the process of creating rules on enforcement provisions, and there's discretion in how they enforce the law that is designed to allow them to take care of outlier buildings, really unusual buildings that need some adjustment or some discretion to change what they can do or they can't do. But the vast majority of buildings, we can't allow some sort of set of procedures that delays penalties, lowers penalties, or allows landlords to game the system with paperwork that they submit claiming that they're following the law when they're really not. So that's what has to happen, is proper rules and regulations to implement and enforce the law. And the two big challenges there are making sure that Mayor Adams does not listen to the real estate lobby by either gutting the law through the renewable energy credit loophole that they could open up, or through weak enforcement and gamesmanship around how the law is enforced on landlords.
So we're back to Civics 101.
This is it. The people have to make their voices heard, and there's lots of ways to do that. Most recently, the rules that are drafts right now, the initial big set of rules, went to a public hearing, and about 400 of us joined that public hearing to make our voices heard loud and clear that we want this law fully implemented and enforced. It was a massive turnout, and 350 Brooklyn members were there, NYCC members were there, lots of the public, experts, advocates, building owners, all saying with one voice that the mayor and the department need to fully implement and enforce the law. So that was a really big signal to the administration to do the right thing here and not listen to the big money lobbyists urging them to gut the law. There's lots of opportunities like that to get involved with an organization like 350 Brooklyn or NYCC or other groups that work on this to push the mayor to properly implement and enforce the law. So, for example, you can sign a petition that we will deliver to the mayor's office. You can join events, rallies, protests, press conferences. You can lobby your member of the city council. So there's lots of things like that that we're doing collectively that are putting pressure on the mayor to counterbalance that insidious voice of the big check writers from the real estate lobby that funded his campaign.
At 350 Brooklyn, if people want to get involved in holding Mayor Adams accountable, you would go to 350brooklyn.org, and it would be the City Action Group. And there's another 350 NYC. So if people are in Manhattan, you would join that group. And then I always like to say this, It's so much more fun working with people, and it's the power of collective work.
Absolutely, absolutely. You can upgrade your building to go off fossil fuels if you're a building owner. You can move to a bike. You don't have to drive, but those individual activities aren't going to get it done. What's needed is mass social action that pushes the government and corporations to change the system at the pace and scale needed. And so you can't do it alone. It works a lot better when you get together with other people to do that. And so 350 Brooklyn is an excellent channel for that. And that's exactly right. Join 350 Brooklyn City Action Group, and you can be plugged right into effective work to push the city to fully implement and enforce Local Law 97, as well as many other issues.
Much of the emissions reductions comes from switching from gas to electric. Is our electrical grid ready for the increased load?
Yes, the grid is ready, full stop. The grid is built for a summer peak. So that's when everybody turns on their air conditioners and the electric grid has its maximum load. And as buildings transition to higher energy efficiency, their electricity use goes down, but also switches to heat pumps, which are a different kind of system that moves energy around and is much more energy efficient. Those heat pumps will maximize out their electrical use in the winter. The grid is built right now for a big peak in the summer and has lots and lots of space for the winter. So that's not to say that in the longer run, the grid doesn't need to be upgraded to increase its capacity to handle all the buildings that are going to move towards electrical use and energy efficiency under this law. It does, but that's really after 2030. So there's plenty of time right now for the utilities and the state to manage that process.
Doesn't this just push the pollution from the buildings to the power plants?
No, it doesn't just push the pollution to the power plants. The other thing that is happening here is that the grid itself, the power plants generating power for the grid and the distributed energy, is going to move towards renewable energy. That has been a process that really stalled out under our former governor, Andrew Cuomo. For about a decade, there was effectively zero new wind and solar built at a utility scale. So the grid did not green under Andrew Cuomo. It stalled out. But now there are a lot of projects in the pipeline that we have good faith in actually being achieved and implemented. And state law says that there should be 70% renewables by 2030. It's not clear whether the state is going to reach 70% renewables by 2030 on the grid, but it's very clear that the grid will become a lot cleaner than it is right now. So as the big theory of how to take care of buildings and the electrical grid is that the electrical grid becomes much more renewable, eventually 100% carbon-free or renewable energy. And at the same time, buildings are turning off their fossil fuel boilers and furnaces and moving heating and cooling onto heat pumps, which are electrical powered and much more energy efficient. So that twin movement at the same time is what gets to a clean and sustainable system.
Lots of work to do.
Yeah, I mean, then it's got to be done really fast. And what has to happen here is that policymakers and the mayor and the governor need to get on it. They need to stop listening to inertial interests like the real estate industry and like the fossil fuel industry and not implement and not make this shift happen. This isn't just some like technical debate on what's possible, what's not possible. All of this is very, very possible. What has to happen is policymakers, elected officials need to ditch those big check writing interests and go with what is necessary for the people. And that is a very rapid transition towards clean energy, which also creates large numbers of good jobs. So, if I sound angry about it, it's true. I am very angry about it because this process should have started decades ago, and it would have if real estate had actually not opposed it and if the polluting interests had not done what they did do. For example, in 2009, Mayor Bloomberg, who was a very problematic mayor, but in this respect was actually trying to do the right thing, he wanted to pass a law something like what Local Law 97 eventually became. And the real estate industry stopped them, dead stop. They couldn't even get a bill introduced in the council. They got crushed. There were a bunch of good laws that passed as a result, but incremental reforms were not what was needed. What we needed was what Local Law 97 now compels on a much shorter timeline. So the real estate industry really should look itself in the eyes here, look in the mirror and think, do we want to actually gut the world's most important local level climate and jobs law? Is that what we're about? At a lobbying level, that is what they're about. So individual building owners are very split on this, but their representational entities right now are coming very hard to gut the law. And we've got to stand up and fight that and make sure that Mayor Adams does not listen to them, that he listens to us instead.
So again, people power.
Totally.
Yep. I wanted to ask about the buildings under 25,000 square feet that are not part of LL 97, yet that the building wants to go green. Do you know?
Yeah, there's no requirements right now.
Yeah.
So, there is nothing pushing on medium and small building owners like me. I'm in a 4-unit co-op. So I'm a part owner of a small building, and there's nothing that tells us that we have to improve the energy efficiency of our building or go off of fossil fuels. And that will have to change over time because if my building, and I know my building is typical, we won't really do anything until we're compelled to do so. And that's just the plain reality of most building owners in New York. Now, those rules and laws have got to be equitable and make sense so that they can be implemented in a way that doesn't increase costs for people who can't afford it. It's got to be simple. It's got to be clear. It can't be like Local Law 97, where it's a complex, technical, hard to understand set of requirements that makes sense for large operations who hire experts and have managers. Local Law 97 is designed for large buildings. That is, buildings with capital planning and experts and consultants and supervisors and management agents. Small buildings are not like that. They're run by regular people who do not have in-depth knowledge of the industry. With small buildings, this is 900,000 buildings in New York City that have no requirements right now. So it's critical that the city move rapidly towards a set of equitable requirements that start to upgrade those buildings over time. What's really important here is that the mayor start to tackle the problem and that we make him tackle the problem, because otherwise it's not going to change. It isn't going to happen otherwise. We need state, city, federal policy, and it's got to happen fast and well.
So I just want to do a little shout out for accelerator.nyc on the web. You can get free guidance and training to greening your building and learn more about LL 97 compliance. There's low interest financing opportunities, and it will also help you to find qualified local contractors and design professionals to help you implement building energy improvements. So
that's great. The accelerator is great, and there's a range of city, state, and federal programs that can help with this kind of a transition. So that is all really useful. So if you want to voluntarily take your building and improve it, you can save money and save the planet at the same time. And you can also create jobs for people who need it. So you should do it as a building owner. But chances are you're not going to do it as a building owner until the state and city actually pass requirements that make sense, that make that transition happen. So for example, the city could say that you can't replace a fossil fuel boiler with a new fossil fuel boiler, that at that moment you need to make the leap to energy efficiency and heat pumps. And that's the kind of change over time that makes a lot of sense for the city to require. Now, there's a lot of detail in that process and subsidization that ought to happen, but basically the city should set requirements and the state should set requirements to rapidly transition all buildings off of fossil fuel power, or we're just cooked.
Very informative. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I just wanted to ask, is there anything that we missed that you'd like to talk about?
The thing about this is that it can get really fascinating when you get into the complexities of stuff. And so, if your listeners are like me, you're kind of intellectually fascinated with different kinds of renewable energy and technical problems, and all that is interesting. But at the end of the day, what really helps is picking up a sign and chasing the mayor around and yelling at him. That's what does this.
Thank you once again for this very informative chat we've had. And our listeners can find out more information about New York Communities for Change at nycommunities.org. And again, you can go to accelerator.nyc for more information about greening your building. Thank you, Pete.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Climate Check, Stories and Solutions. Thanks for listening. To subscribe, go to climatecheck.fm. Climate Check is a production of the Climate Idea Exchange of 350 Brooklyn and Brooklyn, New York. Stay up to date with our releases by following 350 Brooklyn on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Our production team is Alyssa Kropp, Barbara Schroeder, Bryn Fuller-Becker, that's me, Peter Kamali, Claire Schertz, Phoebe Miller, and Michael Dondero. The music you heard in this episode is from Blue Dot Sessions. 350 Brooklyn is a local affiliate of 350.org, a worldwide grassroots climate organization. Join us in finding solutions to counter climate change.